from ABC News. A special 2-hour edition of This Week with Sam Donaldson and Cokie Roberts.
The portraits of tragedy. America fights back. What lies ahead for our country?
We're at war. There's been an act of war declared upon America by terrorists, and we will respond accordingly.
This morning, we'll bring you the latest from America's leaders. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, Attorney General John Ashcroft, and New York Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton.
Plus, New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani, Senate Intelligence Committee members Bob Graham and Richard Shelby, Continental Airlines Chairman Gordon Bethune, and Delta Airlines Chairman Leo Mullen.
That's This Week, featuring George Will. Now from Washington, Sam Donaldson and Cokie Roberts. And from New York, George Stephanopoulos.
Welcome to our program. On this Sunday, the government and the country are slowly turning from the shock and horror of what happened last Tuesday to the grim business of planning the future for terrorist enemies and for American life, Cokie.
That's right, Sam. But the emergency work connected with those attacks is still a top priority today. Are there more terrorists still on the loose in this country who must be hunted down before they can strike? And of course, the recovery work at the attack sites is continuing. George Stephanopoulos has more on that from New York. George?
It's going around the clock, Cokie. And makeshift memorials are cropping up in the streets of New York, and a service for the fallen rescue workers is planned to take place later today at St. Patrick's Cathedral. And Wall Street has run a complete systems check and says it's ready to go at the opening bell tomorrow. We'll have more on all that later in the broadcast, but first we're going to check in on every aspect of this global crisis, starting with the investigation and ABC's John Miller.
Thank you, George. The FBI confirms that a second man has been charged in this case as a material witness. The warrant was issued by a federal magistrate in New York. The FBI is being very tight-lipped about who the man is or what information they believe he could provide. They are still searching for 100 people for questioning in this case. Watch lists have been given to 18,000 police departments and circulated to airports around the country. They're to be matched against flight manifests in case any of these people try to fly either domestically or internationally. The search continues for the black box in the rubble of the World Trade Center. It is the one that they still haven't been able to find out of the planes that crashed, one that they hope may contain more valuable clues. That's it with the investigation at this moment. Now we go to Terry Moran near Camp David with the president.
The president has no public events scheduled at the moment. No meetings we're being told of, and he remains at Camp David, though all that could change. His schedule is still closely guarded. He went to church this morning at the chapel on Camp David. It is said to be one of his favorite places of worship. Yesterday, he chaired a marathon meeting of his national security team, a virtual war cabinet, reviewing the investigation and the potential U.S. response to these attacks. And while we aren't being told much of what went on there, it's clear from officials' comments that those two things go hand in hand. The investigation going not just to build a criminal case, but to convince governments around the world and, if you will, the court of world opinion about the justice of the U.S. response. Finally, the president's also trying to get Americans back to some degree of normal life. I suppose he's doing his part. He's been out walking his dogs. And now for more on what the military is doing, here's John McWethy at the Pentagon.
On one side of the Pentagon, the work to recover bodies is still underway. They have begun a demolition effort trying to knock down the portions of the building that are leaning on other portions, making it unstable. Still 102 people missing in that rubble. They would like to find those remains. Elsewhere in the Pentagon, very serious war planning is underway. We have been told that there are various small cells of military people beginning to pull together various target lists, matching intelligence with capabilities. It is a long and complex process. We have also been told that there are a number of other things underway in this building, but they are warning that whatever the U.S. does is going to be broad, it's going to be intense, and the American people have to prepare themselves not only for one huge set of military strikes, but for a continuing battle. One of the more important developments has been the change in the relationship between the United States and Pakistan. The U.S. has asked for permission to use Pakistani airspace and a number of other important things. And for details on that, we go to my colleague Bob Woodruff, who is in Islamabad, Pakistan.
John, those relations are about to get a lot better. Sources within the Pakistani government tell ABC News that tomorrow a delegation of top diplomats from Pakistan will go to Kandahar in Afghanistan and deliver a message to the Taliban that they better turn over Osama bin Laden within 3 days or face massive strikes from the U.S. government. It is not clear if this message is originating, that this diplomatic mission is originating from the Pakistanis themselves, or they're simply delivering a message from the United States. The Taliban have said over and over again that they will not give up bin Laden, but today they did call a massive meeting on Tuesday of some of their top clerics, possibly 1,000 people, for Tuesday to discuss the defense of the nation. Clearly the noose is tightening around the Taliban now. It is getting very, very hot. Now let's go back to New York City and my colleague Bill Blakemore at the site of the World Trade Center. Bill.
As you can see over my shoulder, the wreckage is still burning and smoldering on the 6th day. Rescuers tell us that when they tunnel into a new area looking for people alive, that sometimes that lets air in and the flames with that new oxygen sometimes flare up again, making their work harder. But they're still going at it, even though nobody has been found alive since the 2nd day, since Wednesday. Engineers and expert rescuers tell us that they know of honeycombs of passages in the basements of the trade towers and other buildings around that, where people could still be trapped alive. So they're still crawling all over the wreckage, working flat out, even though they know that it's virtually certain that none of the more than 4,900 people still missing here will ever be found alive. Now here's Lisa Stark, who covers transportation full-time. She's just outside Washington at Dulles Airport.
Over 1,400 commercial flights are in the air right now, and all of the major airports remain open in the United States, except Washington's Reagan National, which is closed indefinitely. It's not nearly as busy at the airports today as yesterday. We're not seeing those horrendously long lines. The airlines continue to increase the number of flights they are running. Most of the major carriers are operating at least half of their schedule. Delta is up to 70%. The one exception is United. It is operating less than 1/3 of its flights. This has been an economic disaster for the airlines. They are estimating that this week alone they have lost more than $1 billion. And now let's go back to Sam Donaldson in the studio. Sam?
Thank you, Lisa. Earlier we heard the president say the country's at war, and talking with reporters at Camp David yesterday, he elaborated on what that means for our enemies.
This act will not stand. We will find those who did it. We will smoke them out of their holes. We will get them running, and we'll bring them to justice.
Joining us now to discuss this is the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, with whom we spoke within the hour. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Good to see you.
Thank you very much, Sam.
Well, how are we going to smoke them out, as the president says?
Well, by taking the battle to them. The terrorist activity that we experienced this week and that others have experienced over the years is something that strikes just directly at our way of life, the way of life of a free people. And it is, to be realistic, we have to recognize that a terrorist can attack in any time, in any place, using a variety of different techniques. It may be an airplane one day, it may be a ship or a subway or a car. Therefore, the only thing we can do is what the president said. We have to wage a war, and it has to be taken to them where they are, and it will be a broadly based, sustained effort, not in a matter of days or weeks, but over years. People think of the wars we've seen lately, the kind of antiseptic wars where a cruise missile is fired off, shown on television, landing in some smoke and so forth. That is not what this is about.
Okay, that's not what this is about. As you say, the last time people thought about a war involving the United States to any extent, it was the Gulf War. We saw large armies engage each other. That's not this one, is it?
The people we're dealing with have no armies or navies or air forces or battleships or carriers or capital cities even, or high-value targets. What they have is a lot of people. In the case of Al-Qaeda, the network that has been designated as one of the prime suspects, they may be operating in 50 or 60 countries, including the United States. And that means that we will have to use the full weight of the United States government, political, diplomatic, financial, economic, military, and unconventional. And I would underline that.
Let's talk about that, because in 1998, as everyone knows, President Clinton, his administration, lobbed in some cruise missiles at Osama bin Laden. Didn't get him at some of his bases. I take it we're talking about something more than that.
Indeed. This is serious business. We just lost more people than we did at Pearl Harbor. We lost more people than we did all the way up until the Civil War. It is, and it's not over. They are purposeful people. They plan carefully, and we have to get back to our lives, but we have to do it with a heightened state of awareness.
Mr. Secretary, you're not going to tell me, nor should you, anything about military operations, the specifics. I understand that, but I think very clearly you've said that this may require ground forces of some type. If bin Laden hides in that hole that the president talked about, to smoke him out requires men on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, cruise missiles do not get people who are operating in the shadows. We will need to do a host of things. And I should underline, these people, these terrorists, are clever and they're purposeful and they're well-financed. But they cannot function except with the tolerance of other countries, with countries, real states, that do have capitals, that do have armies and navies, and do have high-value targets. And it is the fact that countries around the world have been harboring and permitting the terrorist activities, and in some cases facilitating, in other cases tolerating it, that has to be dealt with as well.
We're told that a delegation from Pakistan is going to Afghanistan on Monday to talk to the leadership of Afghanistan, the Taliban, and say to them very directly that if they don't turn over bin Laden and his associates, they themselves will be at risk.
They themselves, meaning
the
who, the Pakistanis or the Taliban?
Omar.
Well, my goodness, the Taliban has harbored and fostered and encouraged and assisted the Al-Qaeda network. There's no question about that.
But a cruise missile wouldn't work on them then either. It would also require ground troops.
It will take the full force of our government and our friends around the world, political, economic, financial, military, and unconventional. I'm not going to suggest what kind of operations we might have to contemplate, but we do know that Afghanistan is a country that has been at war for years. It has, I suppose, a GDP per capita of about $800, about the price of a ticket from Washington to L.A. And there are not a lot of high-value cruise missile-type targets there either. And
I bring up the business about ground troops not just to inflame the situation, but we have already, as other news organizations, perhaps you yourself, received emails from people in this country who worry about the loss of American life, meaning the soldiers and sailors, Marines, and all of the other service personnel. What would you say to people who may have to face more losses on this battlefront against terrorism?
That what this war is about is our way of life, and our way of life is worth losing lives for.
All right.
And the era of antiseptic warfare, planes dropping bombs from 20,000 feet, cruise missiles flying off in the night, no one getting hurt on the United States or the coalition side, that will not work with this enemy, let there be no doubt.
Let me bring up a couple of things. Let me see if I can dismiss one thing immediately, or maybe not. There are some people who are saying a tactical nuclear strike would be used. Can we rule out the use of nuclear weapons?
You know, that subject, we have an amazing accomplishment that's been achieved on the part of human beings. We've had this unbelievably powerful weapon, nuclear weapon, since, 55 years now plus, and it's not been fired in anger since 1945. That's an amazing accomplishment. I think it reflects a sensitivity on the part of successive presidents that they ought to find as many other ways to deal with problems as is possible.
I'll have to think about your answer. I don't think the answer was no.
The answer was that we ought to be very proud of the record of humanity, that we have not used those weapons for 55 years. And we have to find as many ways possible to deal with this serious problem of terrorism. And if, Sam, you think of the loss of human life on Tuesday, and then put in your head the reality that a number of countries today have other so-called asymmetrical threat capabilities, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, chemical weapons, biological weapons, cyber warfare. These are the kinds of things that are used in this era, the 21st century. And a germ warfare attack anywhere in the world would bring about losses of lives, not in the thousands, but in the millions.
Let's talk about the special forces, the Delta Force, the Rangers, the SEALs, other special units. About 40,000 have been authorized, but you have yet to appoint a civilian director of the Special Operations Forces. Are you going to do that now?
We are going to be addressing the priorities in the department, and interestingly, the review that we've just completed very much focused on homeland defense. It focused on these so-called asymmetrical threats. I've been talking about these problems since I assumed this post at the request of President Bush in January. We clearly, we have a number of vacant posts that still haven't been confirmed in the department, but I'm sure that they'll be confirmed promptly.
I bring it up because General Shelton, the outgoing chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said on the first day, your military is ready. But is our military really ready to fight this kind of war? We haven't made the full transition from being postured against a Soviet Union, which no longer exists.
Well, indeed, we haven't. And the general is absolutely correct when he says our armed forces are ready. If you mean, as he did, that these are volunteer people who are willing to put their lives at risk any day, any place on the globe, and God bless them for that. In terms of being
they have the tools,
in terms of being ready and transformed to deal with these asymmetrical threats, the short answer is clearly we are not. Clearly we are still, to some extent, organized and arranged to deal with the kinds of threats that are still there. They're not gone, but not fully arranged to deal with the new set of threats, and that is why we have been focusing on them.
How quickly can you ramp up? Apparently there's not a lot of time to waste here.
No, there isn't, and it is not something that can be done instantaneously, although there is a good deal we can do. But we will be working with the Congress, and I must say the support we've received from the Congress on these kinds of things has been very encouraging, as well as the country, and I've got a lot of confidence in the American people.
Mr. Secretary, a lot of people in Washington in high places have told us recently on background or on the record that they expect more attacks. There could be more attacks. To what extent is the U.S. military today, this very day, specifically I suppose the United States Air Force, prepared to meet an attack like the one that came last Tuesday?
Sam, you have to be expectant, and that's why the President said we should all have a heightened sense of awareness. A terrorist can do any kind of an attack, any place, at any time. It is not physically possible to defend every place at every time. We have a combatant commander for Europe. We have one for the Pacific. We have one for the Persian Gulf. We've never had a combatant commander for the United States. Under our Constitution, under our laws, the United States military's task is to defend against foreign invasion and foreign threats. The threat we saw recently was from a person in our country, in one of our airplanes, filled with our citizens. This is a law enforcement job. It is a job for the FBI. It is a job for the police.
Well, sir.
Just a minute.
Yes.
And we have a whole set of arrangements and rules that have existed since decades. And what we need to do, and what we are doing, is to review those and ask ourselves how we have to shift our arrangements.
Well,
now,
sir, excuse me for interrupting you, but along with other citizens, I've seen the fighter planes now, high-speed jets, circling Washington, D.C. They're up there for a purpose.
They are.
And I suppose one of the purposes is that if, God forbid, another airliner is hijacked as we're talking, they're going to take action. Am I right?
They are up selectively in the United States. They have been since this event. We have not had fighter aircraft protecting the United States for ages. Sure we do. We have it in very selected places across the United States. We had much broader several days ago. We have in 26 bases across the country. We have pilots in fighter aircraft on
today
on strip alert available to take off in 10 to 15 minutes.
Because
but,
am I correct,
Sam, what
Tuesday,
does that do if it's a subway? What does that do if it's a port? What does that do if it's a ship? What does that do if it's a truck bomb? A terrorist can use any of those techniques.
Your point is well taken, sir. I understand that. That couldn't do anything. But if they try the same MO again and get on an airplane despite the increased security at the airports, do you now have standing orders well thought out that can be implemented quickly to prevent a civilian airliner again with all the humanity aboard from striking the White House or the Capitol or the Pentagon once more?
We have in the certain parts of the country, including Washington, we have aircraft in the air. In other parts of the country, we have them ready to take off. The set of decisions that would have to be made as to whether or not a plane was threatening a high-value target in the United States are complicated, but the short answer is yes, we have people who are prepared to do what might be necessary.
On Tuesday, I'm told the FAA notified someone in the Pentagon that there was a rogue plane apparently headed toward Washington. But you didn't know it, am I correct, until it hit?
Well, I was in the Pentagon and felt the shock of the attack. And
what did you think it was?
A bomb. I had no idea. I looked out the window and raced down the corridors till the smoke was too bad, and then went outside and saw the devastation and talked to an eyewitness who told me that he had seen an aircraft plow into the Pentagon between the first and second floor.
Could you believe it?
No. It's just, it was a sight just amazing.
But today, if the FAA called, you'd know it.
Well, yes, but think about it, Sam. If the call came now, I mean, let's take that plane. That plane took off from Dulles, I'm told, went west, circled all around Washington. No one knew. No, they knew it was off a flight path. They had no idea where it was going.
Two senators from Pennsylvania say they think the target was the Capitol building. Do you know? You know?
So how do you know what's in the minds? There was the plane that crashed, and I would suspect that one of them was heading for the Pentagon, and one may have been heading for the White House or the Capitol. Clearly, they all had an assignment, and this one found it and came in and hit the Pentagon. Knowing it's filled with Americans, American Airlines, right on the side of it, filled with our fellow citizens, and without airplanes on alert. I mean, you don't have airplanes in the air day in and day out. You couldn't afford to do that.
Well, you didn't, but do you? You've just told us selected places in this country. You do today.
We do, and we have some on strip alert. But who knows where the next terrorist attack will occur? But one has to assume that it may be different than that one.
Secretary, thank you very much for being with us. Let's all hope that it won't happen, but I think you've made the point. Everyone needs to be on their guard.
Indeed. Thank you.
Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. Cokie?
Well, now for some more analysis, we turn to ABC's John McQuessie at the Pentagon. The Secretary, of course, did not give us details about what the military is planning, but he threw out the possibility of the use of ground troops. What are you hearing?
Cokie, I am hearing that they are prepared to pull out all the stops. You heard the Secretary doing a number of important things. He's communicating to the American public, he's communicating to the news media that this is going to be a different kind of fight. The nation must prepare themselves for a different reality. One of those realities is probably going to be casualties among American forces. The American public has had in the past few years little tolerance for casualties. He is saying we're going to have to probably put some kinds of troops on the ground in other countries to go after people who are believed to be responsible for these attacks, and the American people must understand that there are risks in that kind of operation. In the past, the United States has not been willing to risk those casualties, and that is the reason that we have not sent troops in to Afghanistan, for example, when it was believed that Osama bin Laden was responsible for other terrorist attacks. He's talking about 50 to 60 other countries in which the U.S. believes there are terrorist cells, including the United States, I might add. All of those countries are being put on notice by the U.S. That the U.S. needs a different level of cooperation. There is going to be an us versus them kind of situation for the United States. A lot of this is going to be law enforcement and diplomacy, but there is definitely going to be military action. There are going to be bombs dropping, and there are probably going to be troops on the ground, Cokie.
Thanks very much, John McWethy at the Pentagon. Sam?
Well, joining us now, as always, George Will. Hello, George.
Sam?
The President and others, of course, are trying to think through what to do now in the aftermath of the attacks. Do you think those who organized those attacks last Tuesday had considered the consequences?
That's the question, Sam. Did they ask themselves the question, but then what? It was Admiral Yamamoto's question. He was the architect, of course, of the most successful surprise attack in military history, the attack on Pearl Harbor. The architect of what he really knew at the time would be a disastrous success. Admiral Yamamoto knew the United States. He'd studied at Harvard. He'd been a naval attaché here in Washington. He knew the strength and vitality and probably a sense of the temper of this country. And so when the leaders of Japan called him in and said, could you organize a surprise attack that would devastate the American Navy at Pearl Harbor, he said, yeah, you develop me some shallow-running torpedoes and I can do that. And then I will run wild in the Pacific for 6 months, maybe a year. But then what? What he meant was, but then Japan would have on its hands an enraged, industrial, continental superpower, which is not a good idea. Now, today's enemies are not like Yamamoto. They're unlike him in two senses. First, they're not sophisticated, and they do not understand the United States. But also, they do not present conventional targets, such as the United States had in going after Yamamoto's battleships and aircraft carriers, particularly at Midway. So what's going on, Sam, at Camp David today is the President and his military and diplomatic aides are trying to decide how to bring the might of the United States to bear against a very unconventional set of targets.
Well, let's talk about that now in our roundtable, where we give you our opinions, and you can take them for whatever they're worth. And, of course, George Stephanopoulos joins us from New York. George Stephanopoulos, let's start with you. How do we combat this? You've heard the Secretary of Defense, but not very specific.
Well, he wasn't. I think what was most striking about what the Secretary of Defense said was his answer to your question when you asked him whether or not we would rule out the use of tactical nuclear weapons. And he very pointedly did not do that. I guess my question back to the Secretary on that matter would be, what good would a tactical nuclear weapon do in this situation when we are going against dispersed, scattered cells in 50 to 60 countries? And I think we obviously have to respond to this forcefully and make sure we get the perpetrators who committed these crimes and to support the crimes. But we also have to ask the question that George Will just raised, but then what? How do we avoid a situation where the magnitude of our response ends up creating more suicide bombers, more enemies, more terrorists?
Cokie, what about that? I mean, whether it's an atomic weapon or just conventional forces, the so-called collateral damage, meaning civilian deaths, are always there, even if you try very hard to avoid them.
Well, I think if they happen right now, that there would be tremendous, maybe it's unfortunate, but tolerance for that. The civilian deaths in this country in the last week were of enormous magnitude. So that I think that the idea that if the American people right now, we know from the polling and from all the outpouring of the last week, are very united behind the idea of going in and trying to do something to get the bad guys. The problem is, what is it we do? Where are they? I mean, as George said, there's not a fleet to bomb. Are we going to, if we put in ground troops, fine. Are we going to put them in 50 or 60 countries? I think not. So finding
we don't have enough now.
But finding the right response is going to be an extremely difficult thing for the President and his team to do, and making that response commensurate with the horror that happened in this country this week.
What is a measured response here?
We're not after a measured response. We're after an effective response. Look, the President said, first of all, he said, we must be patient. Now, that tells me that he's saying we're not going to do something simply to be cathartic. We're not going to have something like the Doolittle raid over Tokyo that made people feel good in April 1942. The first thing is to do no harm. Don't make matters worse. We have been making matters worse for years. Treating Arafat, the most frequent foreign visitor to the White House in the last 8 years, was a terrorist. A Secretary of State of the United States, Mr. Christopher, in 4 years visited Syria, a terrorist state, sponsor of terrorism, 24 times. That's once every 2 months. We're sending all the wrong signals about being risk-averse. The reason Mr. Rumsfeld was here trying to sensitize Americans to what's coming is we fought a war in Kosovo at
We have heard for the Powell Doctrine, go in quickly, get in, get out, and take as few casualties as possible.
But use massive military force. That's also the Powell Doctrine. And George Stephanopoulos, my information is, and it has been all this past week, that when we strike, if necessary, we're going to use massive forces, not just a team of 24 SEALs.
That's right, Sam. But the most effective, to pick up on what George Wills is saying, may not be this massive 500,000 troop invasion.
No, I'm not talking about 500,000. I'm talking about enough to do it rather than just a few people hoping that by stealth somehow you can get that rabbit hole and get him out.
Right, although I think Secretary Rumsfeld, he underlined it during the interview, he said the word unconventional. We'll have unconventional responses. He underlined that twice. I think that could mean something like special forces, SEAL teams, supporting opposition groups in Pakistan who will then go after the Taliban in Afghanistan. Massive and effective are not necessarily the same thing.
One of the important roles that Congress is going to have to play here is to keep the American people patient, because the desire to do something quickly, to have retaliation now, to not go slowly into each of these places the way we've all been talking about, is going to be enormous. And Congress has already come forward. I'm told by my sources there that the cooperation is real. It's not phony just for the cameras, and given the president the authority to do this. But that all sort of speeds up the idea of expectation of a retaliation immediately, and it's going to be very hard to keep people patient.
Cokie, you're right, but Congress was also worried at the beginning, I believe, that the early resolutions that the White House and the administration were asking for were too open.
Oh, that's true.
Covering too many countries, and they wanted to make sure they limited it.
That's
George Will?
I don't think the president will be limited at all, nor should he be, by any language in any resolution from Congress. That's not the way that we've assigned constitutional powers. Look, a senior administration official said to me on Friday, what can you do to Afghanistan that Afghanistan hasn't done to itself in war against the Soviets, in civil war against one another in the last few years?
Well, let me just challenge you.
Another thing we're not going to do, Sam, we're not going to send $1 million cruise missile to blow up a $14 tent, which is what we did 2 years ago.
Well, let me just challenge you on one point, George. You say we're not going to be limited. The president won't. There is the War Powers Act, and the resolution they passed on Friday specifically says that this does not take the place of anything else in the books.
Every president since the passage of that benighted War Powers Act has flagrantly, ostentatiously ignored it.
Oh, and no, that's wrong. They have reported under it while saying they don't recognize it. They have obeyed it.
He's right. The truth is that they have railed against it and called it unconstitutional, but they have reported under it and followed its instructions. And the fact is, it gives the president cover. It makes it easier for him. He then has the support of the Congress. He goes back to the Congress. What happens is no president has ever been denied what he has requested of the Congress under the War Powers Act.
But who believes that if, as they almost did, if Congress refused to authorize the use of force against Iraq, Desert Storm, who believes George Bush would have said, well, shucks, I can't do it. He'd have done it anyway.
George Stephanopoulos, before we end this roundtable, talk about Saddam Hussein in Iraq. There are many people who say, not only is he running a terrorist regime, which fits the president's description, but this is an opportunity to go in and finish the job there.
Well, I think a lot of people have thought that for an awful long time, and there's no question, or at least we have a lot of evidence, that he's continued his support and building of weapons of mass destruction. I think that one of the things the administration would have to be at least careful of in this case, again, before they have any kind of a ground invasion, is to make sure that there is some tie with this particular terrorist act. Otherwise, you run the risk of having an operation that destabilizes the entire Middle East. But I think there's one other possibility you see here, given Saddam's past crimes, that is probably also contemplated in the congressional resolutions. I was struck yesterday when I spoke with two senators, Kay Bailey Hutchison and John Edwards, who both said that they believe that the resolution that they sent to the president authorized assassination. And maybe in this case, that might be the most effective response, not only perhaps for Saddam Hussein, but for some of the other terrorist leaders like Osama bin Laden.
Well, in the case of Desert Storm, and perhaps now that we've declared a war against terrorism, you take out a command and control center, meaning the leader of a country.
Look, Baghdad, which is where Mr. Hussein lives, is full of what the Secretary of Defense called high-value targets. The President has said this is the first war of the 21st century. I think that may be wrong. This may be the second act of the last American war of the 20th century, the Gulf War. Saddam Hussein's fingerprints were all over the original bombing in 1993 of the World Trade Center. They said they were going to finish the job. Well, someone sure as heck has. And I do not believe that this was the work of a group unassisted by some government's intelligence services. After the bombing of the World Trade Center in '93, the American government did not want this traced back to Baghdad because that would have had real consequences, would have compelled us to take actions. It may not be possible to avoid that conclusion.
Cokie, you have the last word here. Would Congress agree to go along with a full-scale effort against Saddam Hussein at this point, you think?
If there was any evidence at all that Saddam Hussein was involved in this, absolutely.
Because that wouldn't just be a SEAL operation or a Ranger operation.
But if you could do something that clean-cut, this would be a much easier operation.
Okay, folks, stay with us, George Stephanopoulos, and all of you, because later on in the program, we're going to talk about the consequences of these attacks and what the president may do on American life here at home. How much freedom will we give up in the name of security, and how will our economy be affected? Still ahead, the chairman of Continental Airlines and Delta Airlines. But first, when we come back, the latest on the investigation from Attorney General John Ashcroft, and a look at the man believed to be responsible for the attack, Osama bin Laden. Plus, Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton, and the two top members of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Bob Graham and Richard Shelby. Do stay with us.
The pictures of your life, they mean so much. But these pictures can save your life. They were taken by GE's new Discovery LS, a breakthrough in cancer detection. It not only locates the tumor, it tells immediately if it's cancerous or not, without surgery. The good news is, you're the picture of health. So now there can be more pictures like these. GE's Discovery LS. Ask your doctor about it.
This is Lance. Lance is tired, he's thirsty, and he's aware that way out here, no one would ever know if he eased up a bit. But he won't. It seems he's developed a fondness for yellow. Discipline creates performance. AIM funds. The idea is discipline. The purpose is performance. The name is AIM.
Once again, from Washington, Cokie Roberts.
The man who is suspected of masterminding the events of last week is Osama bin Laden, who allegedly directs terrorists around the world from his hideout in Afghanistan. One of the few reporters who's interviewed bin Laden is ABC's John Miller. He joins us now from New York. John?
Good morning, Cokie. Osama bin Laden is already charged criminally here in the United States, not in this case, but in an earlier one. He is already on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. There is already a $5 million reward for his capture. Bin Laden has long been a man in hiding, moving every 24 to 48 hours.
Oh my God, there it goes!
Each day since the attacks on New York and Washington, the Bush administration comes one step closer to accusing Osama bin Laden of carrying out the largest mass murder in history.
There is no question he is what we would call a prime suspect. And if he thinks he can hide and run from the United States and our allies, he will be sorely mistaken.
Bin Laden has publicly denied being behind other attacks the U.S. has accused him of. But intelligence analysts say bin Laden plays a shrewd game of propaganda, foreshadowing each attack with the release of a videotaped threat. Just 3 weeks ago, bin Laden said his followers had a big surprise coming for Israel and America. Perhaps the first example of that pattern was the 1998 ABC News interview that introduced bin Laden to the American public. That night, on a mountaintop in Afghanistan, bin Laden told me,
We do not differentiate between those dressed in military uniforms and civilians. They are all targets.
6 weeks later, 2 U.S. embassies in East Africa were simultaneously bombed. 225 people, almost all of them civilians, were killed. Bin Laden has been charged by the Justice Department with ordering that attack. The FBI has sent out a watch list to police and the airlines, 100 names, people wanted for questioning, including some men they believe were trained in Bin Laden's Afghanistan camps, men they believe are here in the U.S.
If we believe that there's somebody in the United States who was associated with this conspiracy and we had evidence upon which to base a charge, we would have and would level that charge.
But what proof will the U.S. offer to link Bin Laden to this latest, largest attack? Investigators are hoping to capture suspects they believe are still here, who may be able to provide some of those links. John Miller, ABC News, New York.
And joining us now is Attorney General John Ashcroft. The Attorney General has been meeting with the President at Camp David, and he's near there now. Thank you for being with us this morning.
It's my pleasure.
Now, you have heard Secretary Rumsfeld say this is not over. These terrorist attacks are not over. What can you tell us to expect here as American citizens?
Well, obviously, we know that the terrorist networks are substantial. There are thousands of individuals around the world. This is a turning point in our history when we've had this kind of massive attack inside our own borders. We've launched a major investigation, the most significant investigation in the history of the United States, to develop an awareness of how we can curtail or prevent, otherwise impede, disrupt, disconcert any terrorist effort in the United States. And we're going to make that the focus of our endeavor. I'll be going to the Hill in the next couple days with a series of legislative proposals that will strengthen our capacity. There are priorities that have been reflected in law enforcement that haven't included terrorism in the past. And we're going to try and get those priorities realigned so that we indicate as the #1 national priority of the United States and our laws that we would prevent and curtail terrorism, that we would disrupt its capacity to impair our way of life.
Well, I want to ask you about those legislative changes in just a minute, General, but first let me ask you some questions about the ongoing investigation. You have 25 people that you have taken in for questioning. Do you think those people are participants in the plot? Will they be arrested?
Well, we're going to pursue leads. We've got some 40,000 tips that have been given to us over the internet, over 5,000 on the telephone. I'm not going to comment on each individual case or on individuals, but our effort is not just to find out who was involved in this plot, but our effort is to detect the scope and extent of the international terrorist networks that are in the United States and disrupt them, and to make very difficult any reoccurrences.
Now, as you know, some critics are saying this is locking the barn door after the horse gets out. Why hasn't the FBI been all over these terrorist cells if we know they're here in the United States already?
Well, there is a terrorism effort in the United States and abroad, and a great deal has been done in recent times to disrupt the efforts of terrorists. Obviously, this particular terrorist attack was not disrupted, but others were. We're going to sort out all the facts about this, but our important effort now is to do what we can to develop measures to prevent further attacks. The President has appropriately said that Americans need to be at work, operating as Americans, but he has also appropriately said that we need to have a heightened awareness of this turning point in our history where the war of terrorism has visited the shores of the United States.
There are some news reports that quote law enforcement officials saying that there were up to 30 other targets of this particular group of terrorists. Can you confirm that?
I'm not in a position to confirm that.
And that Atlanta was one of the targets.
I'm not in a position to confirm that.
There are those who say that this country is falling into Saddam Hussein's trap. You might have heard George Will referencing that earlier, that Osama bin Laden takes credit for some of these things, but he is really working at Hussein's direction. Is this investigation putting too much emphasis on Osama bin Laden and not looking at other terrorists in the world?
This investigation understands that terrorism is a worldwide threat. It's a variety of networks. It obviously understands that Osama bin Laden is a key part of a number of terrorist organizations and operations. This investigation understands that terrorism is a worldwide threat. It's a variety of networks. It obviously understands that Osama bin Laden is a key part of a number of terrorist organizations and operations, but we have not in any way limited our investigation or our understanding of these difficulties to the Al-Qaeda or the Osama bin Laden network or organization. We consider terrorism to be a challenge to our way of life generally, and while he has been named as a prime suspect, we are not limiting our investigation or excluding other options.
And before we get to the legislation, one other thing. We have heard from some in law enforcement that there's the possibility that these terrorists, I mean, you heard the Secretary raising the possibility that terrorists could use biological, chemical warfare. Do you have evidence that any of that has been planned, and what are we doing to protect against it?
Well, obviously our effort is to disrupt and to incarcerate, export, deport people who are involved in terrorist activities. Chemical and biological agents are very dangerous, and we have last week, for example, alerted those responsible for the infrastructure and the components of vital services in the United States to be especially aware and sensitive. We'll take every action to protect our resources. We need to have a heightened sense of awareness.
Mr. Secretary, Mr. General, you will be the legal authority for any kind of military action we take. You serve on the National Security Council. What is your opinion of this question of whether assassination is legal under these circumstances?
Well, the President of the United States has indicated that we are at war, and he's very concerned. I'm not going to talk about any particular policies. I just think it's important for us to know that the nation is being led by a president who understands the gravity of these issues and has indicated that he believes that there was an act of war perpetrated on the United States, and we're going to do those things that are necessary to protect the interests of the United States.
Would you like to see Congress remove the stricture against assassination?
I'm not going to comment on those protocols at this time.
What about, let's turn to congressional action. Would you like to see Congress allow for more surveillance?
We do need to have improved surveillance capacity. We need for the laws relating to terrorism to at least give us the same kind of surveillance and search capacity that we have against organized crime. And in some areas that's disparate now. It's different. It's easier to investigate someone involved in illegal gambling schemes than it is to investigate someone involved in terrorism. For phone taps, for example, our law now provides that we have to get a new order every time we go to a new telephone or to a different jurisdiction with a phone. We need for our phone tap legislation to follow an individual so that no matter where an individual goes, we have the capacity to develop the surveillance, the intelligence information from that kind of phone tap. And those are the kinds of things we're going to be talking with leadership on the Hill about immediately, about helping. Now, the Hill has been very helpful so far. It is to be commended for its response in terms of the resources to fight this scourge of terrorism at this turning point in our history. But we're going to ask them to assist in providing new tools to upgrade and strengthen those tools we have to fight terrorism.
As you know, General, there's been some hesitation in Congress up to this point about that because of concerns about privacy, concerns about American civil liberties. Are you saying that we should put those concerns aside for now?
Well, take a look at a couple of these things. There's no reason why a terrorist should have greater privacy rights than a person in organized crime. It's simply not a concern about privacy that we're talking about in that setting. It's just the fact that we haven't assigned the priority to terrorism previously in legislation that we need to assign now. We do need to take the steps necessary. Technology has outpaced the old wiretap laws. It used to be that a telephone was what someone used in his or her own home. Now telephones travel. There are disposable phones, for example, and it's time for us to have a wiretap law that reflects the fact that what we are really interested in is not what a phone is or whose particular phone it is, but in our ability to tap the communications of a specific suspect individual upon whom we've gotten a court order to surveil their communication.
Now, what about another question along those lines? Some terrorism experts say the best way to protect airlines, for instance, is through passenger profiling. You have been against racial profiling in law enforcement. What about passenger profiling for the airlines, which might have stopped some of these people?
Well, I'm against using race as a profiling component. We will have a tough airline security system, and we will ask everyone to respond to a more secure, more demanding regime that relates to passengers on airlines. I believe profiling people based on their race is unconstitutional. We will do everything within the Constitution to promote the security of our airlines, and I believe having tough security responsibilities and requirements for airlines generally is the answer in terms of airport security.
What about putting sky marshals onto airplanes, as the Israelis do?
Well, we have done that in the past, and that's certainly one of the options which I believe would be appropriate. And I would say that the Justice Department has already offered that some of our law enforcement officials, whether they be Border Patrol agents or U.S. Marshals, could be made available to the transportation system to elevate our security in this specific time of need.
And finally, Mr. General, do you expect any more arrests today? Do you expect any further developments in the investigation today?
Well, when you have 4,000 agents working and you have interviews being conducted, questioning of individuals who may have information at any time, developments can happen in terms of arrests, and arrests as they relate perhaps to the criminal and terrorist activity, or arrests for purposes of detaining individuals so that they can be maintained as witnesses. And so it'd be inappropriate for me to signal any in particular, but when we have this kind of effort, the most massive investigation in the history of the United States, I think we'll be expecting developments.
Thank you very much. Attorney General John Ashcroft joining us from near Camp David. Now for some analysis, we go to ABC's Pierre Thomas. Pierre, what you heard there and what you've been hearing about the investigation, tell us about it.
Well, one of the things that struck me about what Ashcroft said today is that there was sort of a tacit admission that the United States does not have a firm handle on the number of terrorist organizations operating within the United States. One official I talked to yesterday said, look, we're not thinking that anything is imminent, but we just don't know. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, 2 men were picked up the day of the attacks near Texas. They were riding an Amtrak train. My sources tell me they had box cutter knives. They also had $25,000 in cash. These 2 men have been flown to New York, according to my sources, and there's some indications right now, according to my source, that they have ties, potentially have ties to the hijackers. Now, again, it's another example that these groups were widespread, operating for quite some time, Cokie, and they are trying to get a handle on that, and it's very worrisome to them.
Okay, thanks very much, ABC's Pierre Thomas. Joining us now is the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Bob Graham. He joins us from Miami. Thanks for being with us, Senator Graham.
Thank you, Cokie.
Senator Graham, you have been quoted as saying that that these incidents are not over, that this set of terrorist incidents are not over. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
I had a briefing as recently as this morning by the CIA, and they indicated the following. One, that the evidence that they had gathered thus far increasingly did focus attention on Sunni extremists and specifically the bin Laden group. Second, that there was also evidence that there might be other groups, including other terrorist groups outside of Afghanistan, that might be involved in this tragic situation. And that third, this was not necessarily a single act on Tuesday, but rather part of a larger plan. There might be further aspects of that plan yet to be played out both within the United States and outside.
Given that, what should this country be doing? Should people be going on airplanes, going back to work, going to ball games?
We have got to begin to resume normal life, but normal life is not going to be the same as it was on Monday. There will be substantially greater security. I flew on a plane yesterday and will do so again today, and was impressed with the additional restrictions that were imposed. But we cannot allow the terrorists to win the ultimate victory of making them like them, making us be a society that gives up its freedom and liberties and begins to act in the cowardly way that terrorists do.
Of course, the fact that they were able to succeed has been attributed to a massive failure of intelligence. Do you see that as a massive failure of intelligence, and do you think that the CIA chief, George Tenet, should resign?
I do not believe that George Tenet should resign. I believe that he has served this nation well and honorably. What you don't know in this battle against terrorism are all the victories that have been won, because those are all won in the darkest shadows of confidentiality. This was clearly a failure. Who precisely, or what institution, or what failure of resources or others was responsible is something that we'll have to know later. The Senate Intelligence Committee is going to be introducing legislation next week which will deal with some of the issues that we think were probably involved, including the fact that we need to have someone in charge of the U.S. federal government's responsibility for terrorism. We have too much
of a terrorism czar?
We need to have a, if you want to use that term, we need to have someone who has the ability to establish a national program, allocate resources, and be held accountable for our response against terrorism.
Now, there are criticisms that there were Clinton-era regulations forbidding the employment of certain foreigners to penetrate terrorist organizations. Essentially, they didn't want to do business with bad guys. Do you think those should be lifted?
Yes. Essentially, what those regulations restricted was the ability of intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA, to employ people who had suspect backgrounds. The fact is, Cokie, if you're going to get someone who has the capability of getting close to one of these terrorist cells, you're not likely to start looking in a monastery to find them. They're going to be people who have had some prior association and probably have had some prior involvement in the activities of those cells.
So you think that those regulations should be lifted. The other criticism is that the people who actually do have those kinds of human resources in those organizations are the Russians. But to get the Russians to cooperate with us, they have always asked for a quid pro quo on Chechnya. Is there any way of getting to those Russian assets?
Well, I was in Pakistan 2 weeks ago, and prior to that had some briefings with Russian officials as to their attitude towards Afghanistan. And frankly, they are very concerned about the Taliban. It not only is a destabilizing force on their southern border, but it also is a major source of drugs, particularly heroin, coming north into Russia.
So do you think they will now cooperate with us and let us?
I believe that Russia will assist us in our efforts to eliminate the terrorists in Afghanistan.
Finally, Senator, do you think that the stricture against assassination should be lifted?
Yes. In fact, it has largely been lifted. And let me say, this is not a legislated restriction. This is an executive order that goes back to President Ford and has been renewed by every president since that time. But if you're going to deal with a terrorist, there is no way to do it preemptorily other than to be able to use the strongest force to prevent them and eliminate their capability to attack American citizens. And if that means that we have to have the authority to assassinate people before they can assassinate us, yes, we should free that stricture, and the President of the United States can do it at his will.
Thank you so much, Senator Bob Graham, Chairman of the Intelligence Committee.
Thank you.
Sam?
Well, Cokie, all during this program, we've been talking in one way or another about Osama bin Laden, the shadowy figure thought to be in Afghanistan, who is the prime suspect, obviously, behind the attacks this last Tuesday. Americans do not have to agree with what he did, but it might serve us well to see if we could understand, if we can, why he did what he did. And joining us to discuss that is John Miller in New York, ABC's Pierre Thomas at the FBI, and, of course, John McWethy, our man at the Pentagon. John Miller, what motivates Osama bin Laden? I mean, he's been described as someone who simply hates America, but is there more to it than that?
Osama bin Laden fought valiantly against the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. He led troops. He brought money, resources from his family's billion-dollar empire. And after the Afghan war, returned to Saudi Arabia, where he was regarded as a young hero. I think the turning point for bin Laden was during the Gulf War, when American forces came to base in Saudi Arabia to launch the Iraqi war. Bin Laden fought very hard against the Saudi royal family to say, don't let these Americans come here. They will occupy our holiest lands with their military. They will stay here and use that military to support Israel from our holy lands. And he essentially said, if we could run the Russians out of Afghanistan, we can certainly fight Saddam Hussein or whoever we have to from invading our country. We don't need the Americans to protect us.
Well, John Miller, you talk about the American support for Israel. Is bin Laden trying to get the United States to stop supporting the state of Israel? Does he think he can do that?
That's a key goal. Bin Laden has essentially three things on the table. One, first and foremost, the U.S. military out of Saudi Arabia and off the Arabian Peninsula. Number two, end support for Israel. He considers us, our support of Israel, to give Israel the license and a larger cudgel over the Palestinians. And, of course, his fate is very high on, their fate is very high on his list. And to end the bombing of Iraq. Now, interestingly, Osama bin Laden has never been a big fan of Saddam Hussein's, but he claims it's another instance of the U.S. attacking Islamic people and affecting the lives of innocent women and children, the embargo, and so on. That is his basic agenda, and I think the acts of terrorism, which are getting closer and closer to the heart of America, I think they're right there now this week, are designed to make Americans sit up and say, who is this guy, and what does he want, and what do we need to do to make him stop?
Pierre Thomas, who is this guy and the people who work with him? This man is far different from somebody the FBI normally deals with, a bank robber, a crime of kidnapping, something for money. I mean, if he and his associates are motivated by enough will to simply immolate themselves along with other innocent people, how does the FBI get at them?
Well, that's one of the difficult things they're studying right now. Sam, one of the things I might point out is the United States has so many people coming into the country through airlines and various other means. One source told me this week is, how do you deal with that? Part of the way that you stop terrorists is simply having information about them. But these are people that change their IDs repeatedly. These are people that are constantly on the move. And one source told me they do not have a good handle. The FBI is very good after a crime has taken place to track them down. They're less good at finding people before an operation takes place.
Well, Pierre, in this case, we now know some of these people were integrated in American society, lying low. It's reminiscent of the Cold War, where the sides planted spies who were told, don't do anything for 10 or 15 years and then emerge. It's almost impossible to get a line on them ahead of time, isn't it?
Well, that's very, very difficult. What they need a better job of doing is trying to get a sense of who's coming into the country. And I had a Customs Service official tell me we have to start to look at the number of people coming into the United States. If you look back to the Millennium Scare last year, one source said we were very, very lucky to find that man crossing out west with bomb-making material in his truck. If the man had gotten through, we would have had a very devastating attack last year.
John McWethy, you talked earlier about special operations in trying to smoke these people out of their holes abroad that the U.S. military may go after. How does a special ops team work different from what, of course, we're used to seeing on the normal battlefield?
One of their specialties is surveillance, Sam. You can put some of these teams in other countries. They can sit for weeks at a time on mountaintops at some risk to their lives, and they can surveil movements and activities. They can plant listening devices in various places that allow the U.S. to have a much better handle. But One of the things that the nation must understand here, Sam, when we're listening to government officials talk about changes in the law here, it is not just going to be the military that's going to go after them. They are looking at, as various of the guests have just said, changing the laws on not only assassination and phone tapping, but they're also going to be talking and are talking privately about trying to change regimes. What are the rules going to be for dealing with American-directed cyber attacks on other governments' installations? One of the things they're going after is Osama bin Laden's bank accounts, and have been for a very long time. But if they are unleashed with the American ability to attack some other financial institutions via cyberspace, that is another whole dimension of the way the U.S. is going to be going after this network.
Thank you, John. John Miller, have the last word here.
Not been down before, not on this scale, but the use of military forces to effectively, as they say in the police business, make a collar is something that we tried in Panama with a massive conventional force to make a narcotics arrest of President Noriega. Yet, even with a high-profile character, even with Noriega being who he was, it took us days to find him, and there was a siege. The more dramatic example, of course, was Mr. Aidid in Somalia, where U.S. Special Forces went in, seeking to arrest him, to capture him. Not only did they not affect that, but we had U.S. helicopters shot down, the bodies of servicemen dragged through the streets, so much so that the president had to pull those forces out just because of American opinion of what were we doing there and why were we suffering these losses. So to go after Osama bin Laden, who's much better at hiding than either of these other two targets, in a much wider area, in a place where people are going to be committed to fight, they certainly demonstrated that against the Russians, is a really tall order to use the Army to make an arrest.
Thank you, John Miller and Pierre Thomas and John McQuethy. Well, while we've been talking and concentrating on Osama bin Laden and how the United States will attempt to hunt him down and his associates, of course, here in Washington and, of course, in New York, the grim work of recovery and going over those debris continues. And George Stephanopoulos, you've been following that.
That is still the #1 job here, Sam, and they are still calling it, importantly, search and rescue. They don't want to make that shift yet to recovery because they still want to hold out some hope, and they still do hold out some hope that some of the people may still be found. Late last night, I got an up-close and exclusive visit of the tour site with New York Police Commissioner Bernard Kerik.
3 nights ago, this place, I mean, all over here was covered, saturated with the debris. And they've cut a lot of it down. They've taken a lot of stuff out. They've had lines of cops and firemen, mostly firemen, just lines of people. Thousands of guys have been up in there digging through the debris looking for survivors. And this is what's left. We have a couple thousand guys working down here. The firemen, you know, these guys they're going into certain spots where we think, where they believe there may be voids or holes or vacuums. And they've got to be careful. There's 6 or 7 floors underneath this that they're climbing down into.
What do you think when you look at those ruins, is all you can call it?
It disgusts you. I mean, it's, you know, it puts a knot in your stomach. It's a knot in your stomach.
How much longer can you go at this pace, cleaning up this?
We're going to go until it's over.
Any idea how long that's going to be?
I have no idea, don't know, don't care. We're going to go until it's over.
As long as it takes. And that's exactly the message delivered by Kerik's boss, New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani. I spoke with him earlier today. Mr. Mayor, I know you've been getting by on very little sleep, so thanks very much for taking the time to be with us this morning.
Thank you, George.
Let me start. I was down on the site last night with Commissioner Kerik, and they seem to be making great progress last night in cleaning up that area. What's the latest from your view?
They are making great progress. I flew over it yesterday, coming back from the firefighter funerals, and I had flown over it the day before, and just in one day, the progress is enormous. If you need numbers to sort of visualize it, we've removed about 21,000 tons of debris. We've had about 1,200 truckloads that were taken out over the last several days, and they've also cleared all of the roadways so that you can now do
He can now do a lot of the recovery activity a lot easier, so it should go even faster now. And let's hope and pray that we can recover some people. That's our real hope.
It's everyone's hope, Mr. Mayor, but no one has been rescued, I think, since Wednesday. And I know this is a delicate issue for the families, but when do you make the decision to switch this from a search and rescue operation to a pure recovery effort?
When I'm told by the experts, police, fire, the FEMA, federal experts and state experts, when I'm told by them that that's no longer a realistic possibility. And they all tell me now that although obviously it's very difficult and the possibilities are small, there is still hope. So as long as there's hope, then we have to proceed in that direction. I don't know the timing of it, George.
Do you have any idea?
Better.
Any idea of how long that will be?
For as long as it takes. It really isn't for me to assess that. There are people who have done these rescue operations, you know, in the past, and they believe that now and over the next several days, there's still hope, particularly given the fact that there are large tunnels under the World Trade Center. We don't know what damage has been done to them until we can remove the rest of this debris. Probably at that point, we'll have a better idea.
Okay, and I know you're committed also to opening up on Wall Street tomorrow, but there's an awful lot of debris downtown. There's still some very spotty electricity and phone service. Are you worried at all that Wall Street will just be overwhelmed by this influx of 75 to 100,000 workers?
We've done everything that we can to test that. We had dry runs on Saturday. We're going to have them today. We opened the subway lines and sent a lot of people down yesterday to make sure that things will work on Monday. So we're hopeful that it'll work. I mean, it's time to try to get back as much as possible to normal. Not only will the stock exchange be open, but the mercantile exchange will be open, which is actually just to the west of the hot zone. So we're trying to get commercial activity back to normal. It's important for New York. It's important for the American economy that we do that.
What do you say about security? What do you say to people who are worried that some crazy might take this as an opportunity to launch another strike? What measures have you taken?
Don't let them frighten you, and don't let them stop you. You know, the last couple of days when I've had a little time, I've been reading about the Battle of Britain and what the people in England had to go through when they were being bombed every day. And here's what they did. They took security measures that were necessary. They had bomb shelters, and they protected each other, and they helped each other. And their hospitals operated at full bore. But they went about their normal lives as best as they could, because they weren't going to show fear and they weren't going to be fearful. We do not want these cowardly terrorists to have us in any way alter our American way of life. And I'd like New York to demonstrate that to people. This may go on for some time. We have to end terrorism. I believe the United States government is committed to that. And it's going to require us here in America to go about our way of life and not have them imperil it. And New York should be an example of that, since we seem to be, along with the Pentagon and Washington, the first place in which they've attacked us. And we don't want them to stop us.
You've been so praised for your leadership in this crisis. There's even been some talk of maybe having some sort of write-in campaign or other measure to keep you in office. Is there any way that could happen?
No. The reality is that there'll be a new mayor on January 1st, and I will do everything that I can to make certain that whomever that new mayor is, that they're as prepared and as ready and able to go forward with this as I am right now. And there's nothing fortunate that happened in this situation, but at least it happened at a time in my administration where we've been through a lot of crises, a lot of emergencies. I have a tremendous police department, fire department, emergency services. The commissioners, Commissioner Carrick and Commissioner Von Essen, are enormously skilled and experienced. So I think we'll be able to get through this initial part of it, and we'll be able to do a transition that prepares the next administration for what it has to deal with.
Well, thanks for all your work, Mr. Mayor. Thanks very much.
Thank you, George, and thank you very much.
When President Bush visited the disaster site in New York City Friday, among the officials who accompanied him was the junior senator from New York, Hillary Rodham Clinton. All traces of partisanship wiped away. Senator Clinton joins us now from our New York studios. Welcome, Senator. Good to see you.
Thank you very much, Sam.
Well, it's true, isn't it? I mean, the Bushes and the Clintons have engaged in healthy, normal political debate in this country like so many others, and now, at the moment, that's all behind us, isn't it?
Well, you know, Sam, that's what's so great about our country. Now in this moment of crisis, we're united, we're behind our president, and we're moving forward together. I can't say enough about the extraordinary support that New York has received from the president, from my colleagues in Congress on both sides of the aisle. And I know that we're going to have whatever support New York needs in order to rebuild lives and rebuild our city.
I read a couple of op-ed pieces in a couple of New York newspapers suggesting that President Bush should have come earlier. I mean, do you think he should have come earlier?
Oh, Sam, I don't see any reason to engage in that kind of second-guessing. I was delighted that the president got here as soon as... I don't see any reason to engage in that kind of second-guessing. I was delighted that the president got here as soon as security and other considerations could be taken care of. We went with him to the site. I'd been there earlier on Wednesday, and when I saw him in the Oval Office on Thursday, both Senator Schumer and I were delighted that he was going and that he was going to see firsthand what we saw, because I think, as anyone will tell you who's been down there, as good a job as you and all of our colleagues in journalism and especially on television have done describing what happened, you really cannot imagine what it looks like and feels like until you either fly over it or you see it as I have.
And your daughter Chelsea was, what, 12 blocks away when it happened?
Yeah, she was in the area, staying with friends, and both Chuck Schumer and I were spending the early moments of this disaster trying to make sure that our daughters were okay. We were lucky, they were, but a lot of people haven't been as fortunate. And you know, when I was at the Armory yesterday visiting with families who are still hoping that their loved one will be rescued, they have their pictures in hand and the stories that they want to tell, I just couldn't help but feel both grateful for the fact that my daughter was all right, but having a redoubled commitment to doing everything I could to help those families that are going to have to face the reality of having lost a child or a husband or a father or mother.
It's terrible. Let's talk about American life now, though. What happens in the future from the standpoint of the question of security versus relaxation or giving up some of the freedoms that we've enjoyed in this country? How far do we go, for instance, on airline security?
Well, I think everyone recognizes we have to tighten security. We have to do whatever it takes to keep our people safe.
Are you including profiling, Senator?
Well, I think we have to do whatever it takes, Sam, and I believe that, you know, Tuesday changed everything. Tuesday was a day that America has never, ever had to experience, and I hope to heaven that we never have to again. But we are in a war situation, and we're going to have to do things that people do in times of war. I just heard your interview with the mayor, and I think he's right to look at examples in history like the Battle of Britain. Many of us have been studying what others did to carry on, and we know that we have to make trade-offs in convenience, in our freedom of movement, without undercutting or losing our way of life and our values, which are really what make America special and great, and we can't ever let anyone undermine that.
Do we get on airplanes now, and if there are people of Middle East origin, American citizens, for all we know, on that airplane, do we have a problem?
You know, Sam, yesterday at the Armory, when I was talking with the relief workers and the families of missing people, I saw every kind of American. You know, one family came up, you know, holding the pictures of having lost both a son and a daughter-in-law. They were Muslim Americans. Other families were telling me the story of, you know, their daughter who had just gotten married and would never, they thought, be with them again. Every shade of skin color, every kind of background. This was a blow at New York and at America and all we are. And
that's why I ask you, Senator, about profiling, because you say do everything it takes.
That's right.
Does it take profiling?
Well, you know, I think that's going to be up to the law enforcement experts. And I think we have to be cautious. We have to be careful. But let's not go overboard and start, you know, pointing fingers at Arab Americans, at Muslim Americans who are just as devoted Americans as you or I are. We have to find the terrorists, no matter where they are, here at home or abroad, and we have to strike at their sources of funding and support. But we have to do so with the full knowledge that we cannot let anyone, anywhere, change the character of America. So yes, we're going to take every precaution, every security measure that is required, but we're not going to let anyone undermine our way of life, and we're certainly not going to let law-abiding, decent, patriotic Americans, no matter what their religion or their background, be in some way pointed out or harassed.
Before I let you go, speak to this issue of more deaths in this country, perhaps for service personnel. One of the reasons given, and I would like you to respond to this, that your husband, when he was in office, used cruise missiles against Osama bin Laden and did not try to mount a ground operation, was a belief that the American public just wouldn't stand for casualties in our armed forces. Was that one of the reasons? And what about the future when it comes to casualties in the armed forces?
You know, Sam, as I say, I think everything changed on Tuesday. I think the American people have a much greater awareness of the enemy that we face and the sacrifices that will be necessary. I'm absolutely confident that the President and his advisors will put together a plan that will take into account the great difficulty we face. You know, I have some knowledge of what the terrain in that part of the world is like. I have a little sense of history, the successive attempts to try to conquer or invade or control Afghanistan, the most recent being by the former Soviet Union. This is an extraordinarily difficult undertaking, but we have to use any and all means that we believe will create conditions that will lead to the kind of positive outcome that we want. Yes, there will be sacrifices and there will be losses, but we have to proceed in a prudent and effective manner.
So in a word, if we have to take casualties in this war against terrorism, we're just going to have to accept that.
Sam, we just took casualties in New York City. We took maybe 5,000 casualties. We took them at the Pentagon. We have already had men and women, innocent civilians, killed in this war, and we've lost some of the bravest people you could ever meet. Our firefighters, our police officers, our emergency personnel who went in there. They were the frontline soldiers in this war against terrorism. We've already taken casualties. Now we are facing an implacable foe who stands against our way of life and our values. And this is a war that we have to pursue, but we have to do it in an effective and prudent manner. And it's going to take the patience of all of us. And that's why I think everyone has to support our president and all those who are attempting to find the source of this terrorism and stamp it out.
Thank you very much, Senator Clinton, for being with us today.
Thank you.
By the way, the official casualty figure has just gone over 5,000. 5,097 missing figure is the one we're getting now. Still ahead, the airlines respond to questions about their security and their survival. Continental CEO Gordon Bethune and Delta CEO Leo Mullen will join us. Plus, a look at how the U.S. financial markets might react when they reopen tomorrow, with Goldman Sachs International's Bob Hormats. Right after this.
People put off till tomorrow the things they should do today. It's easy, right?
Anthony Padilla, AXA Advisors.
Especially when it comes to a financial plan. I work with a lot of people my age. They say, Anthony, I'm young. What's the rush?
AXA Advisors is one-on-one financial help.
I say, start now. Sure, you've got a lot of expenses, but you've got this huge advantage, too, and that's time. Hey, I know it isn't easy, but my job is to get you started.
AXA Advisors, building futures.
Enter a new era of discovery at Bristol-Myers Squibb, where groundbreaking genetic research is underway.
Winning the Tour de France was a victory for cancer medicines. But Luke, it's just the start of incredible things to come.
At the Bristol-Myers Squibb Center for Applied Genomics, researchers strive to unlock the secrets of breast cancer, Alzheimer's, and diabetes to lead the way in new frontiers against disease.
Hope, triumph, and the miracle of medicine. Bristol-Myers Squibb Company.
Once again, from New York, George Stephanopoulos.
As we just heard, the number of missing continues to climb, now above 5,000 to 5,097. And the attack and its aftershocks have been devastating to the airline industry. Airline officials are already lobbying for a bailout on Capitol Hill. In a moment, we'll speak with the CEOs of Continental and Delta Airline. But first, here's ABC's Lisa Stark at Dulles Airport.
Well, George, even before Tuesday, this year was shaping up as an economic disaster for the industry. Now it is an economic catastrophe. Previously, it was estimated the airlines would lose about $3.5 billion this year. It's now estimated it could be more than 3 times that much. As we've mentioned, they've already lost $1 billion this week alone, and those losses will continue. They are fearful that fearful passengers will stay away from the airlines in droves, and we are already hearing this morning that 300 flight attendants with Northwest Airlines are taking unpaid leave because they are too traumatized to fly. In addition to losing all of this business, the airlines have dramatically increased costs now because of all of the increased security. We are already seeing the effects of some of this. Continental Airlines has announced a 20% reduction in schedule, 12,000 layoffs. American and Northwest are both cutting schedules by 20% and evaluating their staffing. U.S. Airways has asked a number of its employees to take a 25% pay cut. And Midway Airlines, a small carrier that was already in bankruptcy, has now closed up shop and laid off 1,700 people. By some estimates, 100,000 airline employees could lose their jobs, and a number of the major carriers could be forced into bankruptcy. It is likely that the stock prices of the airlines will tumble when the market reopens tomorrow. And all of this has a ripple effect. It affects hotels, rental cars, city tourism. So this will broadly affect the U.S. economy. Because of this, the CEOs are expected to sit down and meet with the Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta, possibly as early as tomorrow, to discuss their economic situation. George?
And Lisa, they say they need a bailout. Where does that stand now on Capitol Hill?
Well, members of Congress did consider a $15 billion relief package. Part of it would have been grants, part of it loan guarantees. That did not pass on Friday, but it is still very much on the table.
Okay, Lisa Stark, thanks very much. And joining us now from Houston is Continental Airlines Chairman and Chief Executive Officer Gordon Bethune, and in Atlanta, Delta Airlines Chairman and CEO Leo Mullen. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning. Good morning.
Mr. Bethune, let me start with you. You heard those numbers from Lisa Stark just a minute ago, but so far the White House has not said that they will support bailout legislation. How can you convince President Bush to support it?
Well, I think he'll read and watch this show and hear from the employees that are losing their jobs in an ever-increasing number, and ultimately they'll have to do something. If you want to have an air transportation system in this country that can get the economic engine running again, you're going to have to do something. Nothing won't work.
Mr. Mullen, can your airline get through this without further furloughs and without a bailout?
Well, I think that in the immediate term, we will be having cutbacks in capacity of the order that was mentioned, about 20% or so. And were this to go on for any extended time without aid from the federal government, then we would absolutely have to consider employee reductions of that size as an option. Obviously, when that is done, it represents a terrific blow to the capacity of the airlines to serve and to carry out all of the security measures that are being provided. I think that it's just crucial in dealing with the government, which we have found, by the way, very receptive to these thoughts, is that the airline industry cannot be made the first casualty of this war. And we are working with the government, and I think in a very positive way, to ensure that we do maintain our capacity to serve.
What other measures is Congress going to have to take, Mr. Bethune? One suggestion on the table is that American and United Airlines are going to need some shield from the liability for these attacks.
Well, I think ultimately they can get to that. I think the more pressing need is to get the confidence of the traveling public restored, keep us available to be there when they do come back. Right now, they've disappeared. And quite frankly, we need to be there when they come back, otherwise we won't have commerce in this country. So that's an issue, but it's not an issue we need to address today.
Mr. Mullen, what do you say to the people who say, listen, we're just too scared to fly?
Well, I think that the security measures that are being taken are very, very positive. As one looks at what happened last week, obviously on Tuesday, we were all consumed with the safety and security of everybody, passengers, employees, in dealing with this terrific challenge that all of us in America did face. But then very rapidly on Wednesday, we went into an extensive discussion involving the industry and the government, many sessions over the phone largely, and remaking the security of this country's airline system. And that, I think, has been done in an extraordinarily satisfactory way. I myself do have great confidence in the measures that are being taken. I think they're responsive to the tests that we have ahead of us, and I think it should give high confidence in our ability to provide a safe and secure aviation system.
I guess the question is, what more are we going to need? And Mr. Bethune, Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta just announced today that he's going to be appointing a task force on security that's going to be looking at a wide range of measures. In the past, the industry has been reluctant to support very strict security measures. And I want to know, do you think that attitude is changing now? And are you prepared to support measures like armed marshals on all planes?
Well, absolutely. But I also believe that we need to have a balance between having a system that works and one that doesn't work. So we need the increased security. I think we've all bought into that, and we all need that. But what we really need is a system that works. This system today is failing because the confidence of the traveling public has been lost due to this act of war. We need to make sure that when the confidence returns, that there are airlines here with the capacity to get the economy moving. Air transportation has, run the economies of the world for 200 years, and it's today air transportation runs this engine.
Well, let's look at that question of what works. Let me start with you, Mr. Mullen, and then Mr. Bethune, why don't you jump in as well. What other security measures are now needed?
Well, I think that the steps that are being taken, both with respect to the addition of sky marshals and additional law enforcement officers at every step of the way, our own attempts to eliminate, say, curbside baggage, that all baggage has to be checked at the counter and the like, all of these are steps that are going to be very helpful.
Excuse me, you say addition of sky marshals, but are you willing to accept armed marshals on every plane, every flight?
I certainly would be.
Absolutely.
And for a time. I think that we have to work very closely with the government to do whatever it takes in a law enforcement way to ensure that the American public has complete confidence in aviation.
George, looking at the load factors, there's certainly going to be seats available for them.
Mr. Bethune, let me ask you about another possible measure being considered. El Al Airlines now locks its pilots in the cockpit for the duration of their flights. Is that a good idea?
Well, I think it is an idea that deserves some scrutiny. There for some accommodation for our pilots, but quite frankly, this is the first time where terrorists have taken over the control of the airplane and not use it to make a political statement, but actually to use it as a bomb. So we need to deny them the guidance of that vehicle, which is used for peaceful commerce, and that may be an issue that needs to be more closely looked at.
Sam raised in his interview with Senator Clinton the possibility of passenger profiling. Mr. Mullen, what do you think about that idea?
Well, there is a program called CAP, computer-assisted profiling, that has actually been used for a time. I think I also heard Attorney General Ashcroft talk about some of the attributes which I think from the American way of life I would never want to see introduced into that, having to do with such issues as racial profiling, which is inconsistent with the American way. But these computer-assisted profiles look at various aspects of just travel habits that can give an indication as to whether or not a passenger might be operating in an aberrant way. And I do think that we do need to use all of the techniques that are at our disposal in order to deal with the magnitude of the crisis that we do face. And we are using every method to ensure the American public that we are going to be very safe as aviation reaches its full potential.
So it's okay to look at travel patterns but not ethnicity or race?
Well, I think... Oh, I'm sorry, Leo, you go ahead.
I would say from my standpoint, he was asked a specific question of race, and I do not think that's appropriate to be included in that. There are some nationalistic questions. Obviously, there are some countries that are somewhat more threatening to America than others, and so those considerations come into play, but not race as far as I'm concerned.
Mr. Bethune, you wanted to get in here.
Well, I agree with Leo. Obviously, he said take race off the table, but leave everything else on the table, and I think that's what's being done, and I think that's appropriate.
Another issue that's come up in all this is the training and the pay of security personnel. These are low-paid people. They're not necessarily go through very rigorous training. What more can we do on that end?
one idea that's been talked about is to nationalize this and make it a national service. Certainly, we would welcome such an attempt to increase the security and have it uniform throughout the United States.
So actually make these a kind of U.S. Marshals?
Well, I mean, you could name it what you wanted to, but it would be a part of our government's responsibility to ensure the safety of the citizens. Right now, it's the responsibility of the airlines, and it could be enhanced and I think, you know, broadened.
That's going to take an act of Congress, Mr. Mullen. Can you get it?
I think we could get it. I think that there's going to be a major discussion going on that very subject. In the European countries, the security measures are the responsibility of the governments, and I favor, and I believe most of my colleagues in the industry favor, the government taking over all of this. I think, and it isn't just a cost situation at all. I mean, at some point somebody has to pay for it in some way. It has to do with giving the confidence to the public that we have a safe and secure aviation system. And I think that the American public generally does have confidence in the security that is provided by our governmental operations.
ABC's Betsy Stark reported last night that some of the restrictions include, for example, not allowing the shipment of electronic materials in the bellies of passenger aircraft. Mr. Bethune, what is that going to mean for the health of the airline industry, those kinds of restrictions?
I think those are arbitrary and ones that are not well thought out. Our problems aren't today the integrity of the cargo system. As you see from this week's events, it had nothing to do with checked bags or any of those issues. You, as I think was the Secretary of Defense mentioned earlier in the show, can't anticipate where it's going to come next. We need to be able to have commerce in this city, in this country, and people ship routinely their needs on our airplanes, and I don't think we should just unilaterally dismiss a whole part of commerce.
So, Mr. Mullen, just so I can be clear on that, I'm not sure if you agree with Mr. Bethune, but you both support the increased security measures on passengers, but are concerned about those on cargo. Is that true for you as well, Mr. Mullen?
I think that the entire gamut of security measures that have been taken are appropriate, including those on cargo, to perhaps give a nuance in what Gordon was suggesting. I think that over the next few weeks, we're going to have to adjust those as we go along. Remember that in one day, really on Wednesday, we have reinvented the entire security apparatus of aviation. It was an incredible effort by the government and the industry through intensive discussions in which both Gordon and I were involved intensively during that day and a half to do this. And to anticipate that we got it exactly right on the first try would be unrealistic. So I think we'll see some adjustments, and I certainly share what Gordon has just said, is we have to make those necessary adjustments to keep commerce in this country moving and to really get the engine of our economic life going again. And everybody knows how absolutely essential aviation is to that. And I'm confident that through a joint effort with the government and the airlines, we're going to do that.
I just have one final question for both of you. There's a report this morning from government officials saying that National Airport is going to be closed for a long time, and some have suggested that it may never open at all. What is that going to mean for the airline industry, and how are you going to cope with that? Mr. Bethune, you first, and then Mr. Mullen.
Well, I support whatever the government decides on that. This is a national security issue, and if they, in their wisdom, say that that's not appropriate, then we can support that. We'll put the service into Dulles, into BWI, and take the longer ride into town. We definitely want to support our government and all it needs to make our citizens secure. At the same time, we want to be there for them when this is over so that we can have an economy that we can all be employed.
Mr. Mullen?
I think that what I've heard, George, is heightened security measures, different traveling patterns coming in on the airplanes international. It is absolutely necessary to do that given the magnitude of this crisis. I would be very, very surprised if Reagan National did not reopen. But I also share Gordon's view. We can handle it out of Dulles or Baltimore if we have to, and people have their way of getting into Washington.
All right, gentlemen, thanks very much.
Thanks, George.
Thank you, George.
And joining us now for more on the economy is Robert Hormats with Goldman Sachs International. Let's go straight to the impact of the airline industry on the overall economy. Both Mr. Bethune and Mr. Mullen talked about ripple effects. What are they?
Well, they're enormous because transportation in this country has been disrupted for people and for goods, as you've pointed out. That's one major factor in an otherwise over weakening economy. The economy has been weak. It's going to get weaker. The disruption in transportation is one part of it. The other is that the American consumer has become much more reluctant to spend. Traditionally, in these circumstances, the consumer sort of hunkers down and feels a lack of confidence in the future and therefore cuts back on spending. Those things together and a number of others will weaken the economic outlook going forward.
Vice President Cheney said this morning that the economy isn't only weak, but it quite possibly could be in a recession.
That's certainly possible. We could have a couple of negative quarters, as he's indicated. The more important thing down the road really is how we as a country and how we as a government respond. As a country, the quicker we can get back to more normal patterns of living, the better it will be for confidence in ourselves and also for the economy. And also the government. The government's very important. The Federal Reserve is going to create more liquidity. That's going to be important. The lockbox on the Social Security surplus is wide open. We're going to spend as much money as we need for security to rebuild New York, perhaps to help the airlines industry.
Because we may be meeting both exceptions now, both war and, as you say, possibly recession.
Absolutely. We have war and possibly a recession, and therefore a more relaxed, a more stimulative fiscal policy, maybe new tax cuts, but certainly a lot more spending can give the economy a very important boost. That will be very helpful. But how the consumer responds, does the consumer become more confident about the future, go back to business, as Mayor Giuliani has pointed out for New Yorkers, get back into the swing of things, that will be very helpful too.
Well, the markets are going to try to set an example tomorrow. They say the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange is going to ring at 9:30 tomorrow morning. What has the Stock Exchange told your firms about how they expect the markets to run tomorrow?
Well, everything has been worked out on for the last couple of days, and I think our firm and others feel confident that they can deal with these issues and move ahead. And there's a lot of confidence in the future that the stock exchange will work, the markets will work, and the firms that are operating will be able to work quite effectively.
But there are probably at least 4 separate issues that Richard Grasso, the head of the stock exchange, has said we have to look at. The security of the buildings, whether or not telephones and computers work, whether or not the environment down there is healthy, and then these various quality of life issues, food, water, transportation. When you look at those range of issues, which are you most worried about?
Well, I think that the security of the apparatus, the communications and the computers has been tested. I think one of the interesting things that for all of us is that the financial community is a competitive community, but it's also a community where there are a lot of friends and a lot of close relationships. And many of our friends are lost. And that psychological impact is going to be enormous. We're in mourning for them, as well as for the firefighters, the policemen and women, the EMS people who tried to save their lives. And even ringing the bell, while we may be able to operate the market effectively, there's going to be a psychological set of concerns that's going to linger for some period of time.
I can't imagine what it's going to be like for all of you to go to work down there tomorrow when you're dealing with the loss of friends and colleagues. Let's look at what you expect to happen tomorrow. What do you think will happen when the markets open at 9:30? What's going to, up or down?
It's very hard to predict the stock market on any given day. One thing that has worked perhaps to our advantage is that the market has been closed for the last 4 days, and that has given time, I think, for people to assess the situation. Probably will mean less of a chance of panic selling than we would have had the market opened up on Tuesday or Wednesday. But that, I think, is going to be one of the factors that's a plus, that we will have perhaps a little bit more stability. But traditionally, in these circumstances, in the past, the market has tended to go down on the first couple of days when it's open and then stabilize and perhaps move up. And I think that's going to be an important factor going forward.
But if you look at the clues from the foreign markets, they were pretty steady early in the week, and then when the rhetoric of war kind of ratcheted up starting on Friday from President Bush, they dropped.
Yes, they did. The European markets dropped out, although the Asian ones did fairly well. I think we're in for a period of considerable volatility because there is still that uncertainty. What's the extent of the war? How much is it going to cost? How many casualties? What effect will it have on the energy supplies? If this is going to be in the Middle East or areas close to the Middle East, the Islamic world, there's always a risk of disruption of energy supplies through direct action, through terrorism, or through governments in the Middle East becoming weaker because of support for the United States. All these potential threats to energy will play a role in the way the market looks at the future. And we're also going to have what I can call a terrorism tax going down the road. We're going to have to spend more for our security of airplanes, security of buildings, security of facilities, internet security, financial security. This is going to have a long-term weight on the economy. The market will have to take that into consideration as well.
So given all that, what advice are you giving your clients?
I think clients have to just be very careful when they go into the market. There are going to be some areas, sectors of the economy that are going to be adversely affected, and perhaps some where people will see investment opportunities because stocks have fallen too low or they see good future prospects. It's going to be a mixed market. You have to select stocks very carefully. I wouldn't advise anyone to jump in, but I wouldn't advise anyone to panic and sell immediately either, because I think the government is, through the Fed and through fiscal policy and through cooperation with other countries, trying to respond in a constructive way. And I think the American people are going to dig down deep into their traditional optimism and try to return to normalcy as quickly as we can, and that will help as well.
When you speak about that, do you in the banking world feel any kind of patriotic responsibility to prop the markets up? There have been some reports that the banks have agreed, perhaps informally, to get in and buy if the market goes in a free fall.
I think we feel a patriotic responsibility to support the U.S. government in what it's trying to do to bring the economy and bring the country back to normalcy. Not so much to prop up the market per se, but to be as honest as we can to our clients and to the viewing public, to people who listen to what we say about the economy and about the future, and discourage panic selling. I think that's one of the things we can do. We can also point out that there are enormous strengths in this country and this economy. We've built up our economic institutions over the past 200 years. They're strong. The Treasury is strong, the Federal Reserve, our financial system, our capital markets are strong. One of the reasons for being able to open the stock market relatively soon, even though it wasn't able to open right away, is to demonstrate that these terrorists who struck a blow at the heart of the American capitalist system are not going to succeed in that can come back, and I think that will help in terms of the morale of the American public and in terms of strengthening the financial system. There are a lot of investors out there who would like to see the market open and return to normalcy. That, again, can help to strengthen the fabric of the American resistance to this horrendous act.
Robert Hormats, thanks very much.
Thank you.
And, of course, ABC News will be on the air tomorrow when the market opens at 9:30. When we come back now, we'll have more from our roundtable. Stay with us.
One day I'm gonna have a family. I want to have a beautiful house.
One day, I will get old.
One day I'm gonna go to college.
How will I get ready for my one day?
When your one day comes, GE can help you be ready with a full range of financial products. Call a representative or 1-800-THINK-GE.
We're born, we die. It's how smart we are in between.
Invest, protect, retire with a name you trust. GE for life.
So let's talk about the markets, the economy, the way American life may change in the days and weeks and months and years ahead. But before we do, one more time, let's join Bill Blakemore, who's in downtown Manhattan. Bill?
Sam, just in the last few minutes, there's been another change of shifts for the search and rescue teams. Firemen have gone in. As they go in, people applaud them from the sides of the street. People have gone around, some officers handing out more masks because they say they're coming across some transponders or some other kind of equipment inside the wreckage, and they may have to do some controlled implosions, as they're saying, which may release more pollutants into the air. They want everybody here to be safe. The other news is that since we were last on the air from this position, the official number of missing here has now risen above 5,000 to 5,097. But as far as all of these search and rescue men are concerned, and women who are working together here, that means 5,097, any one of which might still be alive, and they're going to keep it a search and rescue mission. Sam?
Thanks very much, Bill. Bill Blakemore from Manhattan. So let's talk about it. Tomorrow the market's open. George Will, what do you think is going to happen? People sell? People buy patriotically? What?
I don't think either. I think there's have to be a very slow day. Consumer spending, Sam, is 2/3 of the economic activity in this country, and it is famously driven by psychology. And no one knows the reaction to a trauma such as this. But I would expect people to get back into the market very slowly.
Well, Cokie, normally consumers get frightened at times of tragedy, at times of war.
I think that's right, and I think that you're likely to see that kind of fright. What's been driving this economy is home sales, home improvements, things like that, and having people decide, well, maybe I won't do that right now. It would be somewhat likely. I must say, I think we've probably already had a bigger economic impact than we've been able to tally. I was in San Francisco when this happened and stuck there, and businesses closed down all over the West Coast as well as in the East Coast. Silicon Valley closed down. There were bomb threats day after day in various downtown office buildings all over the country, so that businesses had to evacuate those office buildings and shut down for periods of time. So that, you know, the airlines, it's just completely obvious. But I think when we go through the tally of just this past week and the amount of commerce loss, that the economic impact has already been quite significant.
George Stephanopoulos, what's your guess about the markets tomorrow?
I hesitate to make a guess, Sam, but I do know that up here, just getting to the markets is going to be so difficult. This is a bottleneck in lower Manhattan. I know that the chairman of the stock exchange has said that they want to get everybody there. The subways are open again today, but it's going to be very, very difficult, and there's no supporting businesses now in the area as well. I guess I do agree, though, with Cokie's overall point that we haven't yet calculated the economic impact of this disaster and the costs to come, particularly when we think of all the security measures that are going to be necessary. And I think that it could even be possible that you are going to have to see some kind of coordinated action by the major financial institutions in this country. Remember, that happened just a couple of years ago after the long-term capital crisis, when there was a crisis in global currency markets. They got together under the guidance of the Fed and agreed to come together and buy. I think it's very possible that could have to happen again.
You may be right, George, because we were already headed either toward recession or bumping along that fine line. Now this particular impact, the airlines, all of the rest, consumer spending, and you say to people, well, be patriotic, go out there and put your money right into the market. I don't think it's going to happen. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, it's just an odd response. I just don't think that when we're being patriotic that that's the thing we think of to do. Maybe buy U.S. savings bonds
Give
or something.
blood or something like that.
That's right. I think it's much more likely to be an act of volunteerism.
Okay, let's talk about the changes in American life, beginning with security. George Will, how much freedom are you willing to give up in the name of state security and your own security?
Some, but I really don't think that's a big question. We're not talking about Abraham Lincoln suspending habeas corpus, and we're not talking about internment, as Roosevelt did or allowed during the Second World War of Japanese Americans. If we're talking about additional inconveniences at airports, I think everyone is going to be much more tolerant of those. And beyond that, it's not clear to me what the problem is. Certain rather arcane matters about encryption of internet materials, that sort of thing. But again, this will not brush up against the average American.
Are you going to be afraid to fly, George?
I'm going to think carefully about where I fly, what airports I go through, yes.
George Stephanopoulos, what about you?
Well, yes, to tell you the truth. But let me pick up on what George is saying. Of course, any more inconvenience in getting on airplanes, everyone is going to be willing to accept that. And we're probably going to be heading much more towards what you do see in Israel and in other European capitals, where you have much longer waits in line. I think the far more serious threat, though, and I guess I am more concerned about other threats to civil liberties than George is when you start to talk about having surveillance cameras in large public spaces that do these face scans all across a large area. And secondly, when you deal with, we've already seen some issues in the past where immigrants are treated in a different way, or and can be detained on the basis of secret evidence and with less rights. And I think there's a strong possibility that their rights can be more restricted.
I was in London about 5 months ago, George, when a bomb went off, a terrorist bomb, from probably from some Irish group or other called the Real IRA, in Ealing. They had a picture, because of the cameras the British have almost everywhere, they had a picture of the terrorist leaving the car. Now that obviously makes all of us uneasy, the idea of cameras everywhere, but they are in Britain, which remains a free society.
Cokie, let me come to this business of racial profiling, which I think is very troublesome. I suppose that all of us really are against racial profiling. And yet, the 19 people who are apparently involved in all of this appear to be of Middle East origin, appear to have some belief in Islamic paradise, appear to be, if it's Osama bin Laden, be part of his network. Invariably, I think Americans are going to have to try to sift through what we're against, racial profiling, and the fear of a particular religious group, if you will.
Well, one of the things that I'm told by some of the Arab American associations is happening is kind of a reverse backlash, that people are being sympathetic to individual Arab Americans and Muslims. Now, that's not widespread, perhaps, and there certainly have been some incidents that have been very untoward. But To profile passengers on airplanes for acts of terrorism does not require racial profiling. I mean, some of these guys bought one-way tickets with cash. You can profile that way. And you can say this raises a red flag, as it did when some of these same guys got on a train from St. Louis to go to Texas. The fact that they paid with cash, they were profiled as drug dealers because they did that. So there is profiling on the basis of age. It is unlikely for an elderly woman to be a terrorist. There are all kinds of ways of spotting people that is not just saying we're going after Arab Americans.
Let's not be too squeamish to say that, in fact, ethnicity will be one element of a complicated recipe of considerations in, if you must call it that, profiling. It always has been and always will be a part of intelligent police work. But, you know, the American people, regard to backlash, they know that Islam is one of the world's great religions and that bin Laden is no more typical of it than John Brown, our homegrown fanatic, was of American religiosity.
George Stephanopoulos, get in on this.
That may be, George, and I think for the most part, both you and Cokie are right over the overall reaction, but there have been some very ugly incidents across the country, essentially people taking racial profiling into their own hands. Just this morning in Mesa, Arizona, a Sikh, a man wearing a turban, was shot and killed. There have been attacks on mosques in Washington. This is happening in many different parts of the country. And, you know, I've spoken with many people who say, Arabs who say, listen, we're walking down the street and we just feel the looks. And for a while, there is going to be some of that uneasiness. But I hope, as Cokie was suggesting, we get over it.
There's also, of course, a foreign policy aspect to it, which is that because they think that the Arabs are looking in bad light at the moment. Sharon has called off, Israeli Prime Minister Sharon has called off meetings with Yasser Arafat about peace talks.
Meetings that the President Bush, and the Secretary of State had urged him to hold. But now that these incidents have occurred, I doubt that Mr. Bush and Mr. Powell will jump up and say anything mean about Ariel Sharon.
And Sharon has gone even farther than that. He suggested that Yasser Arafat should be part of this war against terror, and also been very hardline, warning American Jewish leaders that Arab countries are demanding conditions as part of their participation in this coalition. And it now looks that for a very long time, any hope, and it was slim already, of bringing the Israelis and the Palestinians together has gone away.
I think one thing I would like to say on this question of civil liberties, though, in a situation like this, all of us, of course, respond to the danger. And it's the only sensible thing to do. But then you get this mentality where the military, the Secret Service, people who put security first, and we're grateful for that for a period, start running things. And it's important that that not be the case.
In the long run, you're exactly right. I mean, at some point, we let the terrorists win, as everyone has said, if we go that far. I'll just say this final word to those who were pushing hard to reopen Pennsylvania Avenue.
Forget it.
Forget it, and probably you're right to forget it, because that's not going to happen.
Because now the fight's going to be reopening National Airport.
National Airport. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. And, of course, we recognize, folks, that this is just opinion, and you're welcome to disregard it. Cokie and I will be back right after this.
World-class swimmer. Age 73. Made good money selling real estate, but worried he'd outlive his savings.
David Laughlin, AXA Advisors.
People are staying active, living longer. Before Pete retired, I did some planning. Showed him how a guaranteed income could help keep his head above water.
AXA Advisors is one-on-one financial help.
Of course, the way he's going, he'll live to be 100. But we've planned for that too.
AXA Advisors, building futures.
We thank you for being with us today. We are living in a time of transition. No one's quite sure what's ahead. The president says the country is at war, but at the same time hopes the American people will not be called on to sacrifice, his words, and will soon see life return to normal, his words. Those two conditions may prove to be incompatible, war and normalcy. But judging from the reaction at home this week, the American people appear ready and willing to do what's necessary, no matter what adjustments they have to make. Cokie?
Sam, for so many, those adjustments have already begun, horrible adjustments, as they face the loss of husbands, wives, mothers, fathers, children, sisters, brothers, friends. Not since the Civil War have so many Americans lost their lives in one day. This time it was not Americans fighting each other, but Americans coming together, flying the flag, joining in prayer, giving their help, their money, their blood. That spirit of togetherness would be tested in the days to come, but the memories of this awful and awesome week should help to keep it alive.
The ABC television network extends its thoughts and prayers to those who've suffered so much in this national tragedy. We stand steadfast with all Americans, united in hope and courage.
This has been a presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source.